The crystal champagne flute shattered against the marble floor, drawing every eye in the Pinecrest Country Club's grand dining room to our table. My stepfather Richard stood over me, his face purple with rage, his finger jabbing toward my plate like a weapon. "You ordered the Châteaubriand? Are you out of your mind? Do you have any idea what that costs?" His voice carried across the hushed space, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings and polished wood panels. "I can barely afford to keep you fed at that pathetic cafe of yours, and you have the audacity to order the most expensive item on the menu? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, watching the champagne soak into the white linen tablecloth. Around us, the dinner crowd pretended not to stare while absolutely staring. Women in pearls whispered behind their hands. Men in golf sweaters paused mid-conversation. The pianist in the corner had stopped playing, though I wasn't sure anyone else noticed that detail. "Richard, please." My mother Vanessa touched his arm with trembling fingers, her eyes darting around at the watching faces. "People are looking. Let them look." He shook her off, his attention laser-focused on humiliating me. Maybe Maya needs to understand that just because we're kind enough to include her in family occasions doesn't mean she can take advantage. She's not actually a Hawthorne, no matter how much she wishes she were. My stepsister Natalie smirked from across the table, her phone already out, no doubt capturing this moment for her Instagram stories. "Classic Maya," she murmured loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Always trying to keep up with a family that's out of her league." My stepbrother Chris leaned back in his chair, swirling his own expensive scotch with barely concealed satisfaction. "You know Dad's right. You should have ordered the chicken. Something more in line with your circumstances." The waiter who'd taken my order, a young man named Marcus, stood frozen near the kitchen doors, his face pale with obvious discomfort. I caught his eye and gave him the smallest shake of my head. Not his fault. He'd simply written down what I'd asked for, unaware he was lighting a fuse that had been burning for 5 years. 5 years since Richard Hawthorne married my grieving mother. 5 years since he moved into our lives with his 2 adult children and his endless opinions about how I was wasting my potential. 5 years since he started explaining to anyone who would listen that his poor stepdaughter was stuck running her dead father's failing cafe, unable to move forward, unable to accept reality, unable to become anything worthwhile. The irony was so perfect it almost made me smile. Almost. "I think I can afford the Châteaubriand," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the scene unfolding around me. Richard laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. "Oh really? What did you do, finally accept that you need to sell your father's little coffee shop?" "Because I've been telling you for years that clinging to that place is pathetic. It's a monument to failure, Maya. Your father's failure, and now yours." Something cold settled in my chest at hearing him speak about my father that way. Robert Chen had been a gentleman, a dreamer who'd opened the little garden cafe with savings scraped together over 20 years of working 2 jobs. He died of a heart attack 6 months after the grand opening, never knowing that his small cafe would become the seat of something he could never have imagined. Never knowing that I would take his dream and multiply it in ways that would have made him weep with pride. "My father wasn't a failure," I said, still quiet, still controlled. "He was a visionary." Richard snorted. "A visionary who left you with a struggling business and debt you'll never climb out of. Face facts, Maya. You're 32 years old, running a cafe that barely breaks even, living in that sad little studio apartment, driving a car older than some of the waitstaff here. At some point, you need to accept reality and maybe, just maybe, show some gratitude that your mother married someone who can actually provide for her." The waitstaff he mentioned were carefully avoiding our table now, though I noticed James Rivera, the club's general manager, moving through the dining room with purposeful strides. James had worked for my father 20 years ago, back when Dad was still washing dishes at the old Riverside Inn. James knew exactly who I was. More importantly, he knew exactly who owned the building we were sitting in. The dinner had started civil enough, or as civil as any Hawthorne family gathering could be. It was Richard's 60th birthday, and my mother had called me 3 times begging me to attend. "Please, honey," she'd said in that tired voice she developed over the past few years. It would mean so much to him. To me. Just a few hours. You don't even have to stay for cake. I should have known better. I always knew better. But somewhere deep in the part of me that still remembered being 7 years old and watching my mother cry herself to sleep after Dad died, I couldn't quite manage to tell her no. So I'd driven to Pinecrest in my 10-year-old Honda Civic, the one I kept for exactly these occasions, and walked into the country club wearing a simple black dress from a department store clearance rack. The dress actually cost $8,000, a custom piece from an up-and-coming designer I was mentoring through one of my hospitality grants, but it looked unremarkable enough that no one questioned it. The evening had proceeded with the usual passive-aggressive commentary. Chris held forth about his latest business venture, some cryptocurrency scheme that I knew from my own market research was destined to implode within 6 months. Natalie showed everyone photos from a supposedly sponsored trip to Cabo, though I happened to know the resort had dropped her partnership last month due to her declining engagement rates. Richard pontificated about real estate markets and investment strategies, his voice booming with the confidence of someone who'd never actually had to recover from a real financial disaster. And Vanessa smiled and nodded and played the perfect wife, her eyes occasionally flickering to me with something that might have been regret or might have been resentment. Hard to tell anymore. When the waiter had come to take our orders, everyone else had made elaborate shows of selecting items from the menu. Chris ordered the ribeye with truffle butter. Natalie wanted the Chilean sea bass. Richard chose the rack of lamb, making sure to announce its price point as if that somehow made him more impressive. When Marcus got to me, I'd simply looked at the menu and said I'd have the Châteaubriand for 2, medium rare, with the seasonal vegetables and the 2015 Bordeaux to pair. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I genuinely wanted the Châteaubriand. It was excellent here. I should know since I'd personally hired the chef who prepared it and approved the sourcing for every ingredient that went into the dish. But Richard had heard the price tag in his head and something had snapped. Maybe it was the mounting pressure of his own crumbling finances, the real estate portfolio that was increasingly built on leverage and lies. Maybe it was seeing his stepdaughter, the one he'd written off as a failure, ordering without hesitation or apology. Or maybe he was just a cruel man who enjoyed small cruelties, and this was his birthday present to himself. The champagne flute hitting the floor had been an accident, his hands sweeping it aside in his anger, but the scene that followed was entirely intentional. Now he stood over me, breathing hard, his face mottled with rage and something else. Something that looked almost like fear. "Do you know what people think when they see you acting like this?" He hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow carried further than his shouting had. "They think you're a gold digger. They think you're using your mother's marriage to live above your station. They think you're pathetic." I met his eyes and saw a man who'd built his entire identity on appearing successful, on surrounding himself with the trappings of wealth, on making sure everyone knew he was important. A man who measured worth in dollar signs and social standing. A man who'd never once asked me about my life, my work, my dreams. A man who decided who I was the moment he met me and never bothered to look any deeper. "What I think," I said clearly, "is that you're making a scene at your own birthday dinner. Perhaps we should all just enjoy our meals." "That's not an answer." His jaw clenched. "Can you afford this dinner or not? Because if you can't, I'm not paying for your delusions of grandeur." The dining room had gone completely silent now. Even the soft classical music that usually played through hidden speakers had somehow stopped. Every person in the room was watching us, watching him berate me, watching me sit there and take it with what probably looked like embarrassed resignation. If they only knew. If any of them knew. But that was the beautiful thing about building an empire quietly. No one expected it. No one saw it coming. And when the truth finally emerged, the impact was so much more satisfying. James Rivera had reached our table, his expression professionally neutral but his eyes apologetic as they met mine for just a fraction of a second. "Is everything all right here, Mr. Hawthorne?" Richard spun on him. "Everything is fine. Just having a family discussion about financial responsibility. Something my stepdaughter desperately needs to learn." James nodded slowly, then turned to me. His next words would change everything, though I hadn't asked him to speak them. Hadn't planned for this moment. Sometimes the universe just decided it was time. Miss Chen, he said, his voice carrying across the silent dining room with perfect clarity. I apologize for the confusion with your order. Should I have the chef prepare your Châteaubriand in the private owner's dining room instead? Would you be more comfortable there? The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Richard's face went from purple to white. Vanessa's hand flew to her mouth. Chris and Natalie exchanged confused glances, their brains clearly struggling to process what they'd just heard. And I sat there, my hands still folded in my lap, looking up at James with an expression of perfect calm. That won't be necessary, I said quietly. But thank you, James. I think I'll stay right here. The drive from Pinecrest Country Club to my supposed studio apartment took exactly 17 minutes. I knew because Richard timed it once, shaking his head at how far I had to travel from what he called civilization. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What he didn't know was that I drove past my actual residence, the Meridian's penthouse on 42nd floor, and circled back to a modest building in the older part of town where I maintained a small one-bedroom unit for exactly these purposes. I parked the Honda in the surface lot, noting the crack in the windshield I'd never bothered to fix, and sat in the darkness for a moment. My phone had been vibrating non-stop since I left the club. 17 missed calls from Vanessa. 4 from Chris. A dozen texts from Natalie ranging from confused to angry to almost panicked. Nothing from Richard, but that didn't surprise me. Men like him didn't apologize or seek explanations. They simply recalibrated their understanding of power dynamics and started plotting their next move. The only message I opened was from James. I'm sorry. I couldn't watch him humiliate you anymore. I know you wanted to stay invisible. I understood his impulse even if the timing complicated things. James had loved my father like a brother, had stood beside him through the early struggling days of the little garden cafe, had held my hand at the funeral while my mother sobbed and I stayed dry-eyed and numb. He'd watched Richard Hawthorne sweep into our lives with his money and his arrogance and his complete dismissal of everything my father had built. Watching Richard belittle me had finally pushed James past his limit. It's all right, I texted back. Maybe it was time anyway. My second phone, the one registered to M. Chen and connected to my actual life, showed a different set of messages. Sophia had sent updates on 3 different properties we were evaluating for acquisition. The legal team needed signatures on the Riverside Hotel renovation contracts. Our head chef at Sapphire, my flagship restaurant downtown, wanted approval on the new seasonal menu. The ordinary machinery of running a hospitality empire continued regardless of family drama. I changed clothes in the studio apartment, trading the department store dress for jeans and a sweater, and drove the Honda to an underground garage 4 blocks away. There I switched to my actual car, understated Audi that drew no particular attention, and headed to the one place I could think clearly. The little garden cafe was dark when I arrived, the closed sign hanging in the window just as it had every night for the past 8 years. The space was small, maybe 800 square feet, with 12 tables and a counter that ran along the back wall. My father had painted the walls himself, a soft sage green that he said reminded him of the garden his own mother had kept when he was a child in Taiwan. Pictures of that garden hung in simple frames, black and white photographs showing neat rows of vegetables and a small stone bench beneath a cherry tree. I let myself in through the back entrance, breathing in the scent of coffee beans and old wood. We kept the cafe exactly as it had been, down to the mismatched china cups my father had collected from estate sales and the chalkboard menu he'd written in his careful script. But the building around it had changed. I'd purchased the entire structure 6 years ago, quietly, through one of my holding companies. The cafe occupied the ground floor. The 3 floors above had been converted into offices for Chen Hospitality Group's core operations team. The basement, once used for storage, now housed our test kitchen where we developed recipes for all 12 restaurants. Sophia found me there an hour later, sitting at the corner table where my father used to do paperwork late into the night. She didn't ask how I was or what happened. She simply set down 2 cups of tea and slid into the chair across from me. Her expression said she already knew. James called, she confirmed. Said Richard made a scene and James may have accidentally revealed your ownership of Pinecrest. Accidentally on purpose, I corrected. He couldn't take watching it anymore. Sophia sipped her tea, considering. The question is what you want to do now. The family knows you own one country club. They don't know about the rest. We can contain this to just Pinecrest if you want. Keep the bigger picture hidden a while longer. I thought about that. About the careful architecture of secrets I'd built over 8 years. About the shell companies and the strategic anonymity and the deliberate choice to let my family believe I was struggling while I quietly assembled an empire. It had started simple enough. 6 months after my father died, the little garden cafe was drowning in his medical debt. The treatments that hadn't saved him had cost everything he'd saved and more. I was 24, working 80-hour weeks just to keep the lights on, sleeping on a cot in the back office because I couldn't afford rent anywhere else. Richard had appeared in my life like a storm front, sweeping my mother off her feet with promises of security and comfort she desperately needed. I understood why she married him. I even forgave her for it, mostly. But I never forgave the way he looked at me during their engagement party, his eyes calculating my worth and finding me wanting. Never forgave how he introduced me to his friends as my stepdaughter who runs a little coffee shop. Bless her heart, she's really trying. Never forgave the assumption that because I was grieving and struggling, I would always be grieving and struggling. So I'd made a choice. I kept the struggling coffee shop girl persona for them while I built something else entirely in the shadows. I took the insurance payout from my father's life insurance, the one thing his debts couldn't touch, and invested it in a failing restaurant 3 blocks from the cafe. I worked both places, learning the hospitality business from the ground up, making connections with suppliers and staff and regular customers who became advocates. Within a year I'd turned the restaurant profitable. Within 2 years I'd opened a second location. Within 3 I was consulting for other struggling establishments, taking equity stakes in exchange for my expertise. The growth had been exponential but invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. Each successful venture funded the next. Each connection opened new doors. I developed a reputation in industry circles as M. Chen, the turnaround specialist who could resurrect dying restaurants and transform adequate hotels into destinations. I kept my gender ambiguous in all business dealings, let people assume what they wanted, and never corrected anyone who thought M. Chen was a man. It made negotiations easier and kept my 2 lives completely separate. By the time I was 28 I owned 6 restaurants and 2 boutique hotels. By 30 I'd acquired my first country club, a struggling establishment in the suburbs that reminded me of the places my father used to talk about visiting someday. By 32 I had 12 restaurants, 4 hotels, 3 country clubs, and a catering empire that serviced events across the entire metro region. My net worth had crossed $180 million last quarter. And my family still thought I could barely afford groceries. The separation had been intentional, protective even. If they knew what I'd built they would want things from me. Richard would see opportunity for investment or partnership. Chris would pitch his failing ventures, expecting family to bail him out. Natalie would want funding for her influencer dreams and access to exclusive venues for content. Vanessa would be torn between pride and guilt, knowing she'd chosen Richard's established wealth over supporting her struggling daughter. I hadn't wanted any of it. Hadn't wanted their sudden interest or their revisionist history about always believing in me. So I'd stayed hidden, watching from the shadows as they built their own houses of cards while mine rose on foundations of stone. But now James had cracked that careful facade. The family knew I owned Pinecrest. They just didn't know what else I owned or how far my influence actually reached. Should I go see them, I asked Sophia, or let them come to me? She considered the question with the strategic mind that made her an invaluable partner. Depends on what you want the outcome to be. If you go to them, you're still operating from the old dynamic. The daughter's seeking approval, explaining herself. If you make them come to you, you establish new terms. They have to adjust to your reality instead of you adjusting to theirs. I thought about Richard's face when James called me Miss Chen. The confusion giving way to calculation as he tried to understand what owning a country club meant. Tried to figure out if it was profitable or just another of my father's foolish dreams that I'd somehow inherited. He wouldn't know that Pinecrest's membership had increased 40% since I took over, that our event bookings were scheduled 18 months out, that we'd been featured in 3 national magazines as one of the region's premier venues. He wouldn't know because he'd never asked, never cared enough to look beyond his assumptions. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Vanessa, her 5th attempt in the last hour. I let it go to voicemail, listening as her voice came through thin and anxious. Maya, sweetheart, please call me back. I don't understand what happened tonight. Richard is very upset and I just need to talk to you. Please. The please broke something in me, the same way it always did. My mother's desperation, her need for peace at any cost, her inability to choose sides even when one side was clearly wrong. She'd been calling me sweetheart again, something she only did when she needed something. Tomorrow, I told Sophia. I'll deal with them tomorrow. Tonight I need to think. She nodded, standing to leave but pausing at the door. For what it's worth, I'm glad it's out. At least part of it. You've been carrying this alone for too long. After she left I sat in the cafe until nearly midnight, surrounded by my father's dreams made manifest. He'd wanted this small space to be a gathering place, somewhere people could find comfort and community over good coffee and simple food. He'd achieved that in the 6 months he'd lived to run it. The regular customers still talked about him, about his warm smile and terrible jokes and the way he remembered everyone's usual order. What would he think of what I'd built? Would he be proud or horrified that I'd taken his small dream and transformed it into something he never imagined? Would he understand why I'd hidden it from the family, or would he think I was being petty and small? I wanted to believe he'd understand. That he'd see the protection in the secrecy, the wisdom in letting people underestimate me until I was strong enough that their opinions couldn't touch me. But I'd never know for certain, and that uncertainty ached in ways I usually kept buried. The business phone rang, an unfamiliar number with a local area code. I almost didn't answer but something made me pick up. Maya Chen? The voice was male, professional, with an edge of urgency. This is David Park from Metro Business Journal. I'm working on a story about him, Chen's hospitality portfolio, and I've received information that you might be the person behind that company. Would you care to comment? I closed my eyes, understanding immediately what had happened. Someone from the country club had connected dots, made calls, started digging. The wall between my two identities was crumbling faster than I'd anticipated. No comment, I said and ended the call. But I knew it was just the beginning. By morning the business reporters would be circling. By afternoon my family would know not just about Pinecrest but about everything. The careful reveal I'd imagined, the controlled disclosure on my terms, was evaporating. The choice was being taken from my hands. Unless I took it back. I pulled out my laptop and started typing an email to my legal team, my PR advisors, and my core business partners. It was time to stop hiding. Time to step fully into the light and let the pieces fall however they would. Time to show Richard Hawthorne and everyone else exactly who Maya Chen had become while they weren't paying attention. The morning arrived with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. By 6 a.m., the Metro Business Journal had published their story online with a headline that made my coffee taste bitter. Mystery mogul M. Chen revealed, local woman built $180 million empire while family thought she ran failing cafe. They'd done their homework, pulling business records and property deeds and interviewing industry insiders who confirmed that yes, the reclusive M. Chen who'd been quietly reshaping the region's hospitality landscape was indeed Maya Chen, daughter of the late Robert Chen, stepdaughter of prominent real estate developer Richard Hawthorne. The article was thorough, almost admirably so. They'd traced my business growth from that first struggling restaurant purchase through each subsequent acquisition. They'd interviewed chefs I'd hired, hotel managers I'd mentored, suppliers who'd watched me build relationships based on fair dealing and prompt payment. They'd even found the architect who designed the Riverside Hotel renovation, who apparently had glowing things to say about my vision for preserving historic properties while modernizing their functionality. What they hadn't included, because I'd made certain my legal team emphasized the boundaries, was any deep dive into my family dynamics. The article mentioned Richard in passing, noted the irony of his stepdaughter's success happening under his nose, but stopped short of the kind of personal speculation that would have turned this into a human interest piece about family dysfunction. Small mercies. My phone started ringing before I'd finished reading. The first call came from Eleanor Price, the board president at Pinecrest and a woman whose opinion actually mattered to me. She'd been skeptical when I first proposed buying the club 3 years ago, concerned that someone so young couldn't possibly have the capital or expertise to manage such an institution. I'd won her over with detailed business plans and a genuine respect for the club's history and traditions. Maya, her voice carried a mixture of amusement and exasperation. I've had 17 calls this morning from members who suddenly realized that the owner they've never met is the young woman they've been seeing at family dinners for years. Several are mortified. One asked if she could formally apologize for asking you to bus tables during the Johnson wedding. I remembered that incident clearly. Mrs. Patterson had seen me adjusting floral arrangements in the ballroom, assumed I was staff, and handed me a tray of dirty champagne glasses. I'd taken them to the kitchen without comment because correcting her would have revealed more than I wanted revealed at the time. Tell Mrs. Patterson no apology is necessary, I said. I've bussed tables at most of my properties at one point or another. It's how you learn what actually works. Eleanor laughed, the sound warm. That's exactly why you're good at this. But Maya, you should know there's already been a request for an emergency board meeting. Some members are concerned about the publicity, about what it means for the club's reputation to have our ownership situation become fodder for business journalists. I felt my jaw tighten. Are they concerned about the publicity or concerned that they've been dining alongside the owner without knowing it? Because those are different problems with different solutions. There was a pause. You're not wrong. I'll handle it. The board supports you, the ones whose opinions matter anyway. But be prepared for some awkwardness at the next member event. After Eleanor hung up, the calls continued. Sophia checking in with damage control strategies. My head chef at Sapphire wanting to know if the publicity meant we could finally do the profile piece with Food and Wine magazine I'd been avoiding. 2 different hotel management companies I'd been negotiating with suddenly very interested in accelerating our timeline for partnership discussions. And then, inevitably, my family. Chris called first, his voice tight with something between anger and desperation. Why didn't you tell us? That was his opening. No greeting, no acknowledgement of his father's behavior at dinner, just immediate accusation. Tell you what, I replied, keeping my voice level. That I was working? Building a business? Succeeding at something? That you own half the hospitality industry in the metro area? His voice rose. That you'd been lying to us for years, pretending to struggle while you were sitting on a fortune? I wasn't pretending anything, I corrected. You all assumed I was struggling because that fit your narrative. I never asked for your pity or your help. I never claimed to be failing. You simply decided I was and never bothered to ask questions that might contradict that belief. There was silence on the other end, the kind that meant he was trying to find an argument that didn't make him sound worse. Finally he said, Dad wants a family meeting. Tonight. His house. Tell Richard if he wants to speak with me, he can call me himself and ask politely. I'm not responding to summons delivered through intermediaries. I'm not, Chris started, then seemed to think better of it. Look, he's upset. We all are. This is a lot to process. You've been making fools of us. You made fools of yourselves, I said quietly. I just let you. There's a difference. I hung up before he could respond, my hand steadier than I expected. This was the part I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The reckoning where they had to confront not just my success but their own willful blindness to it. Natalie's approach was different, coming through a series of Instagram DMs that ranged from friendly to manipulative to outright hostile within the span of 20 minutes. The first message included several celebration emojis and a breezy, OMG, I always knew you were hiding something amazing. The subsequent messages, when I didn't immediately respond, turned accusatory. You let us think you were poor. You let Dad pay for dinners when you could have afforded them yourself. That's actually sick. The final message was perhaps the most honest she'd ever been with me. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? Everyone I know is messaging me asking why I didn't know my own stepsister was rich. I look like an idiot. I typed and deleted several responses before settling on simple truth. You look like someone who never asked questions about my life because you weren't interested in the answers. That's not my responsibility to fix. The read receipt showed she'd seen it immediately, but no response came. Good. Let her sit with that discomfort for a while. The call I actually answered came just before noon. Vanessa's number flashing on my screen with the same insistence it had shown for the past 16 hours. I picked up on the fifth ring, listening to her breathing for a moment before she found words. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said, and her voice held genuine pain beneath the confusion. "I'm your mother, Maya. How could you build all of this and never say a word?" "When would I have told you?" I asked, not unkindly. "At your wedding to Richard, when he was explaining to his friends that I ran a little coffee shop, bless my heart? At Christmas 2 years ago, when you suggested I look into food stamps because times were tight? At Dad's memorial service, when Richard said it was a shame Dad's business sense hadn't been better because then maybe I'd have inherited something worthwhile?" She made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. "He shouldn't have said those things." "But you let him," I pointed out. "You stood there and you let him diminish me and dismiss everything Dad built. You chose your financial security over defending your daughter." "I'm not even angry about it anymore, Mom. I understand why you made that choice. But you don't get to be surprised that I stopped confiding in you after you made it clear whose side you were on. I never took sides." Her voice strengthened with defensive anger. "I tried to keep the peace, to make everyone happy." "You took his side by default," I said. "Every time you stayed silent while he belittled me, every time you made excuses for Chris or Natalie's behavior, every time you asked me to just let things go or not make waves, you took his side. So I stopped giving you information that you'd either weaponize or that would put you in an uncomfortable position. It was easier for both of us." The silence stretched between us, filled with years of small betrayals and swallowed grievances. Finally she said, "Richard wants to talk to you. He's been on the phone with his accountant all morning. I think he wants to discuss investment opportunities or partnerships or something." I closed my eyes, feeling exhaustion settle into my bones. Of course he does. Now that I'm successful, I'm suddenly worth his attention. Tell Richard that I'm not interested in discussing business with him. If he wants to speak with me as family, to perhaps acknowledge his behavior and work towards something healthier, my door is open. But I'm not becoming his bailout plan or his path to recovering whatever financial mess he's created for himself. "How did you know he's in financial trouble?" The question came out sharp with surprise. "Mom, I've known for 18 months that his real estate portfolio is over-leveraged and that he's been using creative accounting to hide losses. I know his 3 largest properties are in foreclosure proceedings. I know he took out a second mortgage on your house last year. I know because it's my business to know these things, to understand the financial landscape and the players in it. Richard Hawthorne is a player, and not a particularly skilled one." She was crying now, soft sounds that once would have broken my heart and sent me scrambling to fix things. But I'd learned the hard way that some people's tears were manipulative and some were genuine, and both kinds ultimately had to be their own responsibility. "I can't help him, Mom. Even if I wanted to, which I don't, bailing him out would just delay the inevitable. He's built his life on appearances and debt and the assumption that he can always find another deal to cover the last one. That only works until it doesn't. The crash is coming whether I intervene or not. But we'll lose the house. Everything." Her voice was small, frightened in a way that made her sound much older. "You'll lose the house," I corrected gently. "You'll lose the lifestyle Richard convinced you that you needed. But you won't lose everything, Mom. You'll still have your health, your actual friends if you have any who aren't just social climbers, and a daughter who despite everything still answers your calls. That's more than a lot of people have." I heard Richard's voice in the background, demanding to know who she was talking to. Her response was muffled, hand over the phone, but I caught the defensive tone. When she came back on the line, her voice had changed, hardened with the brittle pride I recognized from years of watching her try to maintain appearances. "If you won't help your family when we need you," she said, "then I don't know what we have left to say to each other." "Maybe we don't have anything to say right now," I agreed. "But Mom, when you're ready to have an honest conversation instead of a transactional one, call me. I'll be here." I ended the call and sat staring at my phone, waiting to feel something other than tired resignation. The family I'd once known was fragmenting under the pressure of revealed truth. Richard was scrambling to figure out how to use my success to his advantage. Chris was cycling through anger at being made to look foolish. Natalie was worried about her social media image. And Vanessa was caught between her husband's expectations and her daughter's boundaries, choosing the familiar comfort of her marriage over the harder work of actually seeing me clearly. The afternoon brought more calls, more requests, more people suddenly very interested in Maya Chen's story. A local television station wanted an interview. 3 different business podcasts requested appearances. Someone from a women's entrepreneurship organization asked if I'd speak at their annual conference. I declined everything, referring them all to Sophia, who was handling media requests with her usual efficient grace. What I didn't decline was the email from James asking if I'd come to Pinecrest that evening. "The staff wants to see you," he wrote. "They've known for years, most of them, and they're proud as hell. They want to celebrate you properly, without the members around to make it awkward." That I could do. That felt honest and real in a way that family obligations never had. I sent back a simple yes and tried not to think about the emergency family meeting happening simultaneously at Richard's house, the one I'd been summoned to and had politely declined. They'd talk about me in my absence, that much was certain. They'd strategize and plan and try to find angles to exploit. And I'd let them, because whatever they decided, it wouldn't change the fundamental truth that had emerged into the light. I wasn't the struggling stepdaughter anymore. I never really had been. I was Maya Chen, and I'd built something remarkable while they weren't watching. What they chose to do with that information was entirely up to them. The staff entrance at Pinecrest Country Club opened onto a different world than the one members experienced. Where the main entrance featured polished marble and fresh orchids, the back hallways were painted institutional beige and smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and tonight's dinner service. I'd walked these corridors hundreds of times over the past 3 years, usually in jeans and a simple shirt, stopping to chat with kitchen staff or helping Marcus refill ice bins during particularly busy events. Nobody had questioned my presence because James had quietly let key staff know that the young woman who occasionally showed up and pitched in was someone who cared about the place. What they hadn't known until this morning's news broke was exactly how much I cared and why. The employee break room was packed when I arrived. Day shift workers who should have gone home hours ago had stayed. Night crew had come in early. James stood near the coffee station looking both proud and slightly anxious, clearly uncertain how this would go. The room went quiet when I stepped through the door, dozens of faces turning toward me with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright delight. Marcus, the young waiter from last night's disaster, was the first to speak. He stepped forward with the kind of courage that comes from having nothing to lose and everything to prove. "Miss Chen, I just want to say I'm sorry about what happened at your family's table. I should have said something when your stepfather was treating you that way. You were doing your job," I told him gently. "You handled an impossible situation with grace. There's nothing to apologize for." "But I knew," he insisted. "James told us months ago that you owned the place. I've been serving you for 2 years and I knew, and I still let him talk to you like that. You let me make my own choices about when and how to reveal myself," I corrected. "That's actually a gift, Marcus. Not everyone would have that restraint." The room seemed to exhale collectively, tension releasing into something warmer. One of the line cooks, a woman named Carmen who'd worked at Pinecrest for 15 years, pushed forward with a large sheet cake decorated with amateur enthusiasm. "We made this during prep," she announced, setting it on the break room table. "It's probably terrible because none of us are pastry chefs, but we wanted to celebrate. You've done right by us since you took over, Miss Chen. Better wages, better benefits, actual respect. We figured it was time we showed some appreciation back. The cake was indeed slightly lopsided, the frosting message reading, "Congratulations boss lady," in wobbly letters. It was possibly the most beautiful thing I'd seen in years. The celebration was modest but genuine. Someone produced plastic cups and a bottle of sparkling cider from the kitchen. Carmen cut the cake, which was actually delicious despite her protestations. People shared stories I'd never heard, moments when they'd witnessed me doing something that seemed odd at the time but made sense now. "You helped me carry trash bags to the dumpster during the Morrison wedding," one of the event coordinators said. "I thought you were just being nice." Turns out the owner was literally taking out garbage with me. Well, I pointed out, the garbage needed taking out and I was there. "That's just efficiency." "But it matters," she insisted. The previous owner wouldn't have known where the dumpster was, much less help schlep bags. "You get how this work actually functions because you've done it." "That was always the goal," I admitted. "Dad used to say you couldn't run a restaurant if you hadn't washed dishes, couldn't manage a hotel if you hadn't cleaned rooms, couldn't understand hospitality if you hadn't served people directly." He believed the best leaders worked from the bottom up, not the top down. James raised his cup of cider, his eyes suspiciously bright. "To Robert Chen's daughter, who took his wisdom and built something he'd be proud of. To Maya, who never forgot where she came from even when she was going somewhere extraordinary." The room echoed the toast and I had to look away for a moment, blinking hard. These people, this collection of servers and cooks and housekeeping staff and groundskeepers, understood something my family never had. They saw the work behind the success. They recognized that empires were built by people who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty and their pride checked at the door. After the cake, after the stories and the laughter and the genuine warmth of people who worked hard for their living celebrating someone who'd worked equally hard, James pulled me aside to his small office. The celebration had been wonderful, but his expression said we had practical matters to discuss. "The board meeting is scheduled for Monday," he said without preamble. "Eleanor's doing her best to manage expectations, but you should know there's a faction pushing for your removal as owner. They're claiming the publicity is damaging to the club's reputation and that your family connections create conflicts of interest." I leaned against his desk, processing this information without surprise. "Let me guess. The faction is being led by Stuart Morrison and his cronies? The ones who've been angling to buy the club themselves for the past year?" James nodded. "Morrison's already talking about forming an investment group to make you an offer you can't refuse. He seems to think the family drama will make you desperate to sell and distance yourself from the whole situation." "He doesn't know me very well then," I observed. "I don't run from uncomfortable situations and I definitely don't make business decisions based on personal embarrassment. The club is profitable, the membership is growing, and our event bookings are the strongest they've been in a decade. Those are facts that don't care about Morrison's opinion or my family's dysfunction." "I'll support whatever you decide," James said. "But Maya, you should know that fighting this might mean exposing more of your business dealings. Morrison's people are already digging into your other properties, trying to find something they can use as ammunition." "Let them dig," I said with more confidence than I felt. "Everything I've built has been legal, ethical, and transparent to anyone who bothered to look. If they want to make my success the issue, that says more about them than it does about me." There was a knock at the door and Sophia appeared, her expression urgent in a way that made my stomach tighten. "We have a problem," she said. "Your stepbrother just showed up in the main dining room demanding to speak with you." "He brought a lawyer." "Of course he did." I straightened, smoothing my shirt. "James, would you mind if I use the owner's office for this? I think it's time Chris saw exactly what he's dealing with." The owner's office at Pinecrest was a space I'd designed personally when I took over. It was deliberately understated, furnished with my father's old desk from the little garden cafe and built-in bookshelves holding hospitality industry references and framed photos of properties I'd renovated. The view looked out over the golf course, 18 holes of manicured green that represented months of careful landscape restoration and sustainable maintenance practices I'd insisted on implementing. Chris stood when I entered, his lawyer remaining seated with the kind of aggressive casualness that was supposed to intimidate. My stepbrother looked like he hadn't slept, his usually perfect hair mussed and his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion or stress or both. The lawyer was a man I recognized from Richard's real estate dealings, someone whose reputation leaned more toward creative interpretation of regulations than actual legal expertise. Maya, Chris began, then seemed to lose his momentum. He gestured vaguely at the office. This is really yours. All of it. All of it, I confirmed, taking my seat behind the desk and not offering them chairs. I assume you're not here to congratulate me on my success, so let's skip the pleasantries. What do you want, Chris? The lawyer spoke before Chris could respond. My client and his family believe there are grounds for a legal challenge to your business holdings, Miss Chen. Specifically, we have evidence that you may have used funds improperly diverted from your late father's estate to seed your initial investments. Those funds rightfully should have been divided among creditors and family members, including your mother. I looked at the lawyer with the kind of patience I usually reserved for particularly slow contractors. Mr. Patterson, isn't it? I've seen your work on Richard's property deals. Sloppy contract language, missed filing deadlines, and at least 3 cases where you advised clients to do things that skirted ethics violations. So let's be very clear about what's happening here. You're threatening me with a spurious legal claim based on fictional impropriety because Chris and Richard are desperate to find leverage they can use to extract money from me. Do I have that about right? Patterson's face reddened, but Chris leaned forward, his voice tight with desperation. You owe us, Maya. Family takes care of family. You've been hiding your success while watching us struggle. That makes you just as bad as you're claiming we are. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a file I'd prepared months ago, hoping I'd never need it but knowing the Hawthorns well enough to have contingencies ready. This is a complete accounting of every dollar I've ever earned, inherited, or invested. The initial capital for my first restaurant purchase came from Dad's life insurance payout, which was legally mine as the sole beneficiary he named. The payout was $200,000. I turned that into my current portfolio through 8 years of 18-hour days, strategic decisions, and partnerships with people who valued competence over connections. I slid the file across the desk. You're welcome to review it with actual competent legal counsel, though I doubt Richard wants to pay for that level of expertise given his current financial situation. You'll find everything properly documented, taxed, and completely legal. What you won't find is any obligation I have to bail out a family that spent years treating me like a charity case while building their own lives on unsustainable debt. Chris's hand shook slightly as he took the file. Dad's in real trouble, he said quietly. The foreclosure proceedings started this week. Mom's going to lose everything. He made his choices, I said without inflection. Choices that included using your mother's home as collateral for deals that existed only in his imagination. Choices that included belittling his stepdaughter at every opportunity while never once asking if she might actually be succeeding at what she was doing. Those were his choices, Chris. The consequences are his to manage. But you could help. Chris's voice cracked. You have the money. You could make this all go away. I could, I agreed. But I won't. Because helping Richard now would just enable the same patterns that got him here. He'd take my money, stabilize temporarily, and within a year he'd be in the same position because he never learned to build anything real. He only learned to borrow and bluff and hope the next deal covered the last one. That's not a foundation. It's a house of cards, and it was always going to collapse. What about Mom? She doesn't deserve this. Your mother made a choice when she married Richard, I said gently. She chose financial security over emotional honesty. She chose social status over defending her daughter. Those were her choices to make and I don't judge her for them. But she doesn't get to outsource the consequences to me now that the security she chose is evaporating. I'll make sure she has a safe place to land when the house goes. I'll help her rebuild something real if she wants that. But I'm not saving Richard's empire, and I'm not pretending the past 8 years of their treatment didn't happen just because it's suddenly convenient for them. Patterson stood abruptly. You're going to regret this attitude, Miss Chen. The business community doesn't look kindly on people who abandon family in their time of need. The business community, I replied, standing as well, seems to be doing just fine with my approach. I've had 3 partnership offers since this morning's article ran. My restaurants are fully booked through next quarter. The hotel occupancy rates are at 94%. So I'll take my chances with community opinion, Mr. Patterson. You and Chris can see yourselves out. After they left, I sat in the quiet office watching the sun set over the golf course. Sophia appeared in the doorway, reading my mood correctly and simply waiting. That was harder than I expected, I admitted. I thought I'd feel triumphant, having them come asking for help and being able to refuse. But it just feels empty. Because you're not cruel, Sophia said. You're just done being their scapegoat. There's a difference. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When I opened it, my breath caught. It was a photo of my mother, clearly taken without her knowledge, sitting in her car outside what looked like a grocery store. She looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that went bone deep. The text below the photo read simply, "She's been sitting here for an hour. Can't afford to go in and can't admit she needs help. Still want to play hardball?" I found my mother exactly where the photo showed, parked in the far corner of the grocery store lot under a broken streetlight. Her hands gripped the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing left in her world. I tapped on the passenger window and she startled, her face cycling through shame and relief when she saw me. "Get in my car," I said through the glass. "We need to talk." She followed silently to the Audi, settling into the passenger seat with the careful movements of someone trying not to brake. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Finally she said, "Richard told me not to contact you. Said you'd made your position clear and we needed to maintain our dignity. How's that working out for you?" I asked without cruelty. "The dignity part." She laughed, the sound broken and wet. "I have $40 in my personal account. Everything else is frozen or gone. I came here to buy groceries and realized I can't even afford milk anymore. But I couldn't go home empty-handed because then I'd have to admit it's really this bad." I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app, transferring money to an account I'd set up months ago in her name alone. "You have access to $50,000 as of right now. It's yours, not Richard's, not community property. Enough to figure out your next steps without panic." She stared at the confirmation on her phone screen. "Why would you do this after everything?" "Because you're my mother," I said simply. "Because Dad loved you. Because being angry at your choices doesn't mean I want you to suffer. But Mom, this comes with conditions. You need to leave Richard. Not immediately if you're not ready, but soon. You need to stop enabling his delusions and start building something real for yourself." The tears came then, years of suppressed truth spilling over. "I don't know who I am without him," she whispered. "Without the house and the status and the life we built." "Then maybe it's time to find out," I suggested gently. "Dad used to say the best things grow from scorched earth. Sometimes you need to burn everything down to see what's actually worth keeping." 3 months later, I stood in the little garden cafe watching my mother arrange flowers in the window boxes Dad had installed decades ago. She'd moved into a modest apartment, filed for separation, and started volunteering at the cafe while she figured out what came next. Richard was facing multiple lawsuits and criminal charges. Chris had taken a job in his public defender's office doing community education about predatory business practices. Natalie was working retail and slowly building something real instead of performed. The empire I'd built still stood, stronger now without the weight of secrets. And my family, broken and rebuilding, was finally learning what my father always knew. That true worth wasn't measured in appearances or assumptions, but in the quiet dignity of work honestly done and relationships built on truth instead of convenience. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.